There was a decision I never made. Not because I didn't see it. Not because I didn't understand its importance. But because I knew that choosing it would change everything. So I learned how to live around it. I told myself that not choosing was a kind of choice. A neutral one. A temporary one. I believed that by staying still, I was keeping all possibilities open. What I didn't understand was that time does not respect hesitation. It chooses for you. The decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with a countdown or an ultimatum. It showed up quietly, disguised as an opportunity that made me uncomfortable. An invitation that asked too much honesty. A fork in the road that didn't look urgent enough to justify disruption. I saw it clearly. And I stepped aside. I told myself I would come back to it later, when I was more certain, more prepared, more stable. I treated the moment like something fragile that needed perfect conditions to be handled correctly. Those conditions never arrived. Life continued because it always does. Days filled themselves with routine. Responsibilities accumulated. Other choices appeared, smaller ones, easier ones, and I made those without hesitation. Meanwhile, the big decision waited. Silently. I learned how to build a life that didn't require me to answer it. I adjusted my plans. I redirected my goals. I filled my schedule with things that felt productive and reasonable. From the outside, my life looked intentional. Inside, it felt provisional. Like everything I was doing was meant to hold me in place until I finally decided. Years passed. Not wasted, occupied. That's the lie we tell ourselves when we avoid the truth. As long as we're busy, we're not stuck. As long as we're moving, we're not avoiding anything. But movement without direction is just circling. I started to feel a strange tension beneath my days. Not anxiety, not sadness, something closer to pressure. As if my life were slowly bending around a missing pillar. I ignored it. I became skilled at justifying my hesitation. I told myself that decisive people make mistakes. That rushing into things ruins lives. That patience is a virtue. Those explanations sounded wise. They were also convenient. Every time the thought resurfaced, you need to choose, I silenced it with practicality. There was always a reason not to act yet. Something that needed finishing first. Someone who might be affected. Some stability that couldn't be risked. I framed my avoidance as responsibility. What it really was fear. Fear of regret. Fear of being wrong. Fear of discovering that the decision wouldn't save me the way I secretly hoped it would. Because part of me believed something dangerous, that this one choice would fix everything. That once I made it, my life would finally feel aligned. That belief made the stakes unbearable. So I postponed. I told myself that time would clarify things. That one day the right answer would become obvious and the choice would make itself. Time did clarify things. Just not in the way I expected. Slowly, the space around the decision began to close. Circumstances changed. People moved on. Options narrowed. What once felt like a living question started to feel like a relic. I noticed that I stopped imagining outcomes. Not because I had chosen one, but because imagining them hurt too much. The decision didn't disappear. It fossilized. And with it, something inside me hardened. I adapted to the life that grew in its absence. I found ways to be functional. Acceptable. Even content, in a muted way. I learned how to live without asking myself what might have been. But the cost of that adaptation was subtle and constant. I felt slightly out of place everywhere. Slightly behind my own life. As if I had arrived at a destination without remembering why I was there. Sometimes, in quiet moments, the memory of the decision returned with unsettling clarity. Not as a fantasy, as a fact. A reminder that my life had branched once, and I had chosen not to step onto either path. I had stood still. And the world had moved on. The most painful realization came much later, when I understood that I was no longer avoiding the decision. I was mourning it. Because the moment to choose had passed without ceremony. No one told me it was over. No door slammed. No opportunity announced its expiration. It simply became something I could no longer reach. I had spent so much time trying not to make the wrong choice that I let the only meaningful one expire. And now, I was living the consequences of a decision I never made. I didn't know yet what that meant. But I knew one thing with terrifying clarity: whatever came next, it would not be neutral. Because indecision is never free. It just charges you later. At first, nothing bad happened. That's the most dangerous part of avoidance: it rarely punishes you immediately. Life doesn't collapse when you hesitate. It reorganizes itself quietly around your silence. I continued living. Working. Planning. Smiling in the right places. I told myself that if the decision truly mattered, it would return. That fate would knock louder next time. It never did. Instead, smaller choices began to stack up in its shadow. I chose what was available instead of what was meaningful. I accepted what fit instead of what challenged me. I built a life that didn't contradict my indecision. From the outside, it looked like progress. Inside, it felt like compromise layered on top of compromise, until I could no longer tell where I had first bent. I noticed changes in how people spoke to me. Not dramatic ones, subtle shifts. Fewer questions about my future. More assumptions. More statements that treated my current life as permanent. I didn't correct them. Correcting them would have meant admitting I was still undecided. And admitting that would have meant facing the truth: I wasn't waiting anymore. I was hiding. The decision I had avoided became harder to name over time. It lost its sharp edges. It turned into a vague sense of something else, something I no longer allowed myself to define clearly. That's how you survive regret before it fully forms. You blur it. But the consequences were still there, even if I pretended not to see them. Opportunities that once aligned naturally with that decision stopped appearing. Conversations shifted. Paths diverged. People who might have been part of that other life became distant figures, living proof of what I had not chosen. I told myself that was normal. That everyone has roads they don't take. What I couldn't admit was that I hadn't not taken the road. I had stood in front of it until it closed. The pressure I had felt earlier didn't disappear. It changed shape. It became heaviness. A low, constant weight behind my thoughts. I started waking up tired without knowing why. I lost interest in things that once gave me a sense of direction. Not joy direction. That loss was subtle but devastating. Without direction, effort feels pointless. You keep moving, but you don't know what you're moving toward. Days become tasks. Years become routines. I began to feel like a spectator in my own life. Watching myself fulfill obligations I hadn't consciously chosen. Saying yes to futures that felt increasingly detached from who I thought I was supposed to be. Sometimes, late at night, I tried to revisit the decision mentally. I told myself I would finally face it honestly. I would examine it, weigh it, choose. But when I tried, something stopped me. Fear, yes. But also grief. Because deep down, I knew I was no longer deciding between two open paths. I was deciding whether to acknowledge that one of them was gone. That realization hurt more than making the choice ever would have. I tried to pretend I could still act, that it wasn't too late. I imagined myself stepping forward now, reclaiming what I had avoided. But the images felt strained, unrealistic. The world I would have stepped into had continued without me. Timing matters more than we want to admit. Some decisions are alive only for a while. They require a specific version of you, a specific moment, a specific openness that doesn't last forever. I had waited past that window. And now, every attempt to choose felt like an imitation of something that should have happened earlier. That's when the regret turned sharp. Not regret for choosing wrong, but regret for refusing to choose at all. I started seeing the decision everywhere. In small moments of dissatisfaction. In the way I reacted to stories of people who had acted decisively. In the envy I felt toward those who had risked something and lived with the consequences. I envied their clarity. Even when their lives weren't better than mine, they felt owned. Mine felt borrowed. The worst part was realizing that my life had become the default outcome of indecision. Not the result of intention, but of avoidance. I was living in the space left over after the choice expired. I couldn't blame anyone for that. No one had stopped me. No one had forced me to wait. I had believed that not choosing would protect me from regret. Instead, it guaranteed it. I began to understand something painful and irreversible: the decision I avoided hadn't stayed frozen in time. It had moved on. And now, my life was asking a different question: not what will you choose, but how will you live knowing you didn't. That question didn't come with options. Only consequences. I tried, once, to go back. Not in reality, in intention. I told myself that even if the moment had passed, even if the decision no longer looked the same, I could still reclaim its meaning. That choosing late was better than never choosing at all. That belief carried me for a while. I began to act as if I still had agency. I made changes that looked decisive on the surface. I rearranged parts of my life. I took steps that felt bold compared to my long paralysis. But something felt wrong. The energy wasn't there. The choice no longer felt alive. It felt like an apology made too late to matter. That's when I understood the final cruelty of avoidance: when you wait long enough, the decision doesn't come back as an option. It comes back as a ghost. It reminds you of who you were when it mattered and who you are now. I realized that I wasn't struggling to choose. I was struggling to accept loss. Loss of timing. Loss of momentum. Loss of the version of myself who could have stepped forward without carrying years of hesitation. The decision I avoided hadn't simply disappeared. It had reshaped my life silently, pushing me into a version of reality that required no courage, only compliance. And I had complied. For a long time, I tried to forgive myself by explaining it away. I told myself I had been cautious, thoughtful, responsible. That anyone in my position would have done the same. But those explanations stopped working. Because they didn't change the truth. The truth was that fear had made my most important choice for me. And fear is not neutral. Fear doesn't keep options open. It closes them slowly, politely, without confrontation. I began to see my life clearly for the first time, not as a series of events, but as a consequence. Everything I was living now flowed logically from the decision I never made. The relationships. The routines. The quiet dissatisfaction I carried without knowing where it came from. This wasn't fate. It was inertia. Accepting that hurt more than blaming circumstance ever could. There was a period when I wanted to punish myself for it. To replay the moment endlessly, to imagine what would have happened if I had acted differently. To torture myself with alternatives that no longer existed. But eventually, I understood that punishment wouldn't restore anything. The choice was gone. What remained was responsibility, not responsibility to fix the past that was impossible, but responsibility for how I would live with the knowledge of what I had avoided. That was the real second chance. Not a chance to redo the decision. A chance to stop repeating its pattern. I began to notice how easily I still slipped into hesitation. How instinctively I delayed uncomfortable truths. How quickly I reached for safety when uncertainty appeared. Avoidance hadn't ended with that one decision. It had become my language. So I learned to listen for it. Every time I felt the urge to postpone something important, I paused. Every time I told myself it's not the right time, I asked whether I was protecting myself or hiding again. That awareness didn't make me fearless. It made me honest. I stopped expecting life to present me with perfect moments. I stopped waiting for clarity before action. I stopped believing that certainty was a prerequisite for choosing. I had learned the cost of waiting. And I wasn't willing to pay it again. There are things I will never recover. Some paths are closed forever. Some versions of myself exist only in memory, as proof that timing matters and courage has an expiration date. I carry that grief with me. But I don't let it decide for me anymore. If you're listening to this and you're standing in front of a decision you keep postponing, I want you to understand something I learned too late to make it painless, but early enough to make it matter. Not choosing is still a choice. And it is rarely the one you think you're making. You may believe you're keeping all doors open. In reality, you're letting them close one by one without ever touching the handle. I avoided one decision because I was afraid of being wrong. What I didn't realize was that avoiding it guaranteed a different kind of wrong, one without drama, without resistance, without a clear moment to point to and say that's where it happened. It happened quietly. It happened while I waited. And when I finally understood that, there was no way back. Only forward, with the knowledge that time will always choose for you if you refuse to choose for yourself. I live with that now. Not with bitterness. With vigilance. Because the life I'm living today is the result of a decision I never made, and I won't let the next one pass me by in silence. That's the only way I know how to honor what I lost.